I was beginning to think that cats and elephants would go unnoticed by the propagandists. Since the release of Carrying the Liar, they have been pretty quiet on addressing the issues and heavy on slandering me. Just over a month after the release of my film, Gavin Stone responded at apollohoax.net and later that day released his own response video. His film makes several false statements and downright omissions. At the end of his video, Stone writes, "To this date, Jarrah has not provided any evidence that what was in orbit was Apollo 11. He has only proved that there was something up there at the time." What Stone does not explain in his video is how Proton 4 would have re-entered the atmosphere unidentified and remain unidentified for a month, given that countless astronomers, who the propagandists insist, are able to know when, where and what all Earth-orbiting spacecrafts are at all times. And suppose, hypothetically, that it was indeed Proton 4 entering the atmosphere, then what? Are we to believe that astronomers around the world would have been able to draw attention and identify Apollo 11 if seen from Earth orbit over a week, when it apparently took them a month to identify Proton 4 despite tracking it for 250 days? The best excuse Evan Burton could provide was, "Part of the reason for the delay may have been Soviet secrecy regarding launches, orbital data, and the reluctance of NORAD to release and confirm orbital data. At that time, such information may have been considered classified for an initial period." Burton so far has failed to answer what NORAD would possibly have to gain by withholding information on a Russian satellite, which we know was not even used for military purposes. This means Burton's explanation relies on whether or not the USSR went public with Proton 4. To challenge Burton's claim, I went straight to where I found my newspaper articles in the first place. If what Burton says is true, then therefore there should be no documentation at the time of its launch. I checked the November 1968 printings of the Sydney Morning Herald and found what I was after in the first place I looked. In the November 18th printing, the Herald ran the following story. "Space Station launched, Moscow, Sunday. Russia launched a 17-ton cosmic laboratory, Proton 4, into orbit yesterday. The Soviet news agency, TASS, said the unmanned Proton 4 was the world's biggest automatic space station and carried scientific instruments weighing 12.5 tons for studying radiation. It has an orbit with an apogee of 310 miles and a perigee of 160 miles. Given the Soviet Union publicly announced the launch of this satellite and happily gave out its orbital data, we know that it is not some classified spacecraft that Russia waited until after re-entry to tell the world about. We can therefore conclude that it would have been easy for government and amateur astronomers alike to track this spacecraft based on the information that the Soviet Union had released in the days after the launch. Taking this into account, if it was going to re-enter the atmosphere, astronomers would have known it.
Spectacular scenes over the South Pacific as the space station Mir raced to its fiery demise.
For once, Mir behaved exactly as predicted, landing over 3,000 kilometres east of New Zealand, an anxious world relieved.
Around this time I found this article, Stone had also gotten in contact with the Perth Observatory to ask why it took them so long to identify the satellite. His message was answered by Andrew Williams.
In 1969, you're talking about the height of the Cold War. The Russians wouldn't be publishing orbital elements for their satellites, and while the US would have been monitoring them using radar, communications weren't instant.
One could say such about a Soviet spy satellite, but not a space station whose launch and orbital data the Russians proudly announced in the days that followed liftoff. I find it unlikely that the communications from NORAD would have taken 250 days.
Now, anyone can grab elements of any non-classified spacecraft off a website. But in 1969, I'm surprised it was as short a time as a month for the information to trickle down as far as Perth, via posted letters or telegrams. International calls were expensive and rare. Just knowing the launch details wouldn't have been enough, assuming they were available, as the orbit would be decaying day by day. Also in Perth, the government astronomer at the time, Mike Candy, would have had to work out positions from the elements by hand, using a slide rule or possibly a mechanical calculator, not a computer.
But as we established, because the required orbital data was published at the time in the Australian newspapers, and thus the US and others had been tracking it for 250 days, this information would therefore already be within the grasp of the Perth Observatory long before this satellite supposedly re-entered.
I doubt we would have any records of the event, apart from archived press clippings which you apparently already have.
Gee, I wonder why they haven't any records. Maybe they were lost, along with all but 2 of 700 original Apollo 11 tapes. In his video, Stone retracts his initial statement that Apollo would have been barely noticeable in Earth orbit, but also tries to maintain his old statement. What we are going to do is play Stone's video and compare it with the ever-conflicting statements of other propagandists.
Jarrah's comments in his video Cats and Elephants do actually have a basis for discussion. It seems that some people will say that it would have been hard to miss, and some people would say it's been barely noticeable. I am the Gavin Stone that he talks about in his video, and I still stick by this in terms of noticeability for orbiting objects. Most orbiting objects are barely seen at all.
Which orbiting objects? Give names.
Apollo would, however, have been quite bright and moving fast, but noticeable in terms of people calling the police? I don't think so.
On January 15th, 2008, Phantom Wolf wrote in to claim, "The ISS was highly visible over New Zealand last night around 9 PM. Strangely, the radio stations reported an influx of UFO sightings. Funny how no one who didn't know about it going over noticed its passage." So, apparently, the International Space Station is noticeable enough for people to call up the radio networks and report UFOs, but Apollo wouldn't have been noticeable enough for people to call the cops? In response to my video, Windley wrote, "I should have taken a picture of all the people who stopped in my street to gawk at the last ISS transit. These were people who largely didn't expect it. They noticed a bright, steadily moving object that had no aeroplane navigation lights. They stopped to wonder what it was." I wonder if any of those individuals ran to call the police for more info on what they saw. That, to me, sounds like one of those times you report those sightings, if not to the police, then to your friends.
Although Jay Windley's right when he says it would have been the brightest object in the sky next to the Moon and Venus, I still suggest most people would have found it difficult to research what an object in the sky was back in 1969. After thinking about it some more, I was a bit naive in not remembering that there were only a few orbiting satellites in 1969. Growing up with multiple satellites above me, the Iridium network etc., has rendered me more or less immune to noticing orbiting objects.
That makes no sense. The lack of objects in the sky would actually have made it easier to identify satellites. The fewer objects in orbit, the fewer objects to track.
I thus retract my claim that Apollo 11 will be hardly noticeable. I am not the kind of person to not admit when I'm in error, but in this case I am, so I retract my claims. However, if the Apollo 11 CSM was orbiting Earth, it's only in the sky for around 3 minutes at a time, hence moving quite fast, at which point you would probably notice it out the corner of your eye. The magnitude of Apollo 11, assuming it was around the same height as the ISS, would have been a little less than the magnitude of the ISS. To see how bright this is, you can use the website Heavens Above to track the ISS and view it when it comes over your part of the world. That's if you're lucky and it comes over your part of the world, and you shall see what I mean about this brightness. The International Space Station is bright and noticeable as it's moving quite fast across the sky.
It's difficult to make heads or tails from this statement. Although claiming he retracts his barely noticeable statement and that the space station is bright and noticeable, Stone also says that you probably would only catch Apollo in the corner of your eye given its less illumination. If that's the case, why does Windley put the two craft in the same category?